Daniel always believed he was right, not in a loud way, not aggressively, but quietly. Deep inside, he carried a strong belief. I know what I'm doing. He wasn't arrogant on the surface. He didn't argue much. He didn't try to dominate conversations, but he had something more dangerous, an invisible ego, the kind that doesn't shout but refuses to change. For years, Daniel lived his life based on his own understanding, his own decisions, his own perspective. And whenever something didn't work, he didn't question himself. He questioned the situation. This wasn't the right opportunity. People didn't understand me. The timing was wrong. Excuses, but not obvious ones, smart ones, convincing ones, the kind that protect your ego while slowly destroying your growth. Daniel didn't see it because ego hides itself. It doesn't appear as weakness, it appears as confidence, and that's what makes it dangerous. One day, something small happened, but it created a crack. Daniel was working on a project, something important. He had spent weeks on it, planning, building, believing it would work. Then he showed it to someone experienced, someone who had real results, real knowledge. The feedback came quickly, and it wasn't what Daniel expected. This won't work. Simple, direct, honest. Daniel felt something inside him react, not logically, emotionally, a slight discomfort, a silent resistance. His mind immediately responded, "They don't understand my idea. They didn't see the full picture. They're wrong." That was his ego, protecting him without him even realizing it. He nodded politely, pretended to listen, but inside he rejected everything. And then he continued, ignored the advice, trusted his own thinking, and launched the project, confident, certain, unquestioning. Days passed, then weeks. Nothing happened. No growth, no result, no success. Slowly, reality started showing, but Daniel didn't accept it immediately. He held on, tried to adjust, tried to fix, but deep down, he knew something was wrong. One night, sitting alone, Daniel stared at his screen, empty, silent, and for the first time, a question appeared. What if they were right? That question felt uncomfortable because it challenged something deeper, his identity, his belief, his ego. And that's where growth begins. Not when everything works, but when something inside you breaks. That night, Daniel didn't find answers, but he found something more important: doubt. Not weak doubt, but honest doubt. The kind that forces you to look at yourself instead of the world. And that was the beginning of a battle he didn't even know he was fighting. The battle between ego and growth. Daniel couldn't ignore the result anymore. The project had failed. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but clearly. There was no growth, no traction, no sign that it would work. And yet, he didn't accept it immediately, because accepting failure is not hard. Accepting that you were wrong, that's hard. That's where ego steps in, not to help you grow, but to protect you from discomfort. Daniel sat at his desk, staring at the numbers, flat, unmoving. But inside his mind, there was movement, fast, loud, defensive. It wasn't the right market. The audience didn't understand. The timing was bad. Excuses started forming automatically. Not forced, not fake. They felt real, logical, even reasonable.
And that's how ego works. It doesn't lie, obviously. It distorts reality just enough to protect you. Daniel believed those thoughts because they were easier than accepting, "I made a mistake." That sentence felt heavy, uncomfortable, almost threatening. Because if he accepted that, then what else could be wrong? His thinking? His decisions? His identity? That's the real fear. Not failure, but self-questioning. Because ego is built on certainty. I know. I'm right. I understand. But growth requires something different. I don't know. I might be wrong. I need to learn. And that shift is painful. Daniel wasn't ready for it. Not yet. So instead of reflecting, he defended. A few days later, he met a friend. They asked about the project. How did it go? Daniel paused for a moment, then answered, "It didn't really work, but honestly, the market isn't ready for something like this." It sounded confident, controlled, but incomplete, because it avoided the truth. He didn't mention the feedback he ignored. He didn't mention the decisions he made. He didn't mention his own role, because ego avoids responsibility. Not completely, but strategically. It shifts focus from self to external, from I to them. And that's what keeps people stuck. Because if the problem is always outside, you never change inside. Days turned into weeks. Daniel moved on to another idea, another plan, another opportunity. But something strange happened. The same pattern repeated. Excitement, confidence, action. Then, slow decline. No result. Again. This time, the discomfort was stronger because repetition reveals patterns, and patterns reveal truth. Daniel started noticing something. Different situations, same outcome. Different ideas, same result. That couldn't be coincidence. But his ego still resisted. It's just bad luck. Maybe I need a better idea. Maybe I need more time. More excuses, more protection, less growth. That's the cycle. Ego protects, growth stops. Daniel felt stuck, but he didn't fully understand why, because the problem wasn't visible. It wasn't external. It was internal. And internal problems are the hardest to see, because they feel like truth, not illusion. One evening, Daniel sat in silence again. No distractions, no noise, just his thoughts. And for the first time, he didn't try to escape them. He observed them, carefully, slowly. He noticed something important. Every time something went wrong, his mind blamed something else. Every time he failed, he avoided looking at himself. Every time he got feedback, he rejected it, not consciously, automatically. That realization was uncomfortable because it exposed something, a pattern, a habit, a defense system. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Daniel leaned back and asked himself a question. If I'm the problem? The room felt heavier, because that question carries weight. It challenges everything, but it also opens something, possibility. Because if you are the problem, you can also be the solution. That thought was new, unfamiliar, but powerful. Daniel didn't have answers yet. He didn't know what to change or how to change, but for the first time, he stopped blaming and started questioning. And that is where growth begins. Not with action, not with success, but with awareness. But awareness is only the first step, because what comes next is harder. Letting go. Letting go of ego, of certainty, of the need to be right. And that is where most people fail.
Daniel couldn't escape the question anymore. What if I'm the problem? It stayed in his mind. Not loudly, not constantly, but deeply, like something waiting to be faced. For days he tried to ignore it, distract himself, stay busy, move forward. But the question didn't leave, because truth doesn't disappear. It waits until you're ready to face it. One evening, Daniel opened his old project files, not to fix them, not to improve them, but to understand. For the first time, he looked at his work without defending it, without protecting it, without justifying it. And something strange happened. He saw things he had never seen before. Mistakes, clear ones, obvious ones, the kind that were always there, but hidden behind his ego. He noticed the feedback he ignored, the advice he rejected, the details he overlooked, and slowly a realization formed. They were right. That sentence felt heavy, not because it was negative, but because it was honest. And honesty breaks ego, because ego is built on illusion, on certainty, on being right. And when that illusion breaks, it hurts. Daniel felt it, not physically, but mentally, emotionally, a quiet discomfort, because now he couldn't pretend anymore. He couldn't blame others. He couldn't escape responsibility. He saw his role clearly, and that clarity was uncomfortable, but necessary. He sat there for a long time, thinking, reflecting, not trying to fix anything, just understanding. And then he realized something deeper. It wasn't just this project. It was a pattern, a repeated behavior. He remembered other situations, other failures, other moments where he ignored advice, where he believed he knew better, where he avoided listening. And they all had one thing in common: him. That realization hit harder, because now it wasn't one mistake. It was a mindset, a way of thinking, a hidden ego that had been controlling his decisions for years. Daniel leaned back and closed his eyes. For the first time, he didn't feel defensive. He felt exposed, not to others, but to himself. And that's the hardest exposure, because you can't hide from it. You can't argue with it. You can't escape it. You either accept it or ignore it. And ignoring it would mean staying the same. Daniel didn't want that anymore, not after everything he saw. So he made a decision, a quiet one, but powerful. I need to change. Not his goals, not his ideas, but himself, his thinking, his approach, his ego. That decision didn't feel exciting. It felt heavy, because change requires letting go of certainty, of pride, of the need to be right. And that's not easy, because ego gives comfort. It makes you feel in control, even when you're not. But growth requires discomfort. It requires uncertainty. It requires humility. And humility is something Daniel had never practiced, not intentionally, but now he had to. The next day, Daniel did something different. He reached out to the same person who gave him feedback before, the one he ignored. His hands hesitated while typing, because this wasn't easy. This was his ego facing reality. He wrote a simple message: "I think you were right about my project. Can you help me understand what I missed?" That message carried weight, because it required something rare: admitting you were wrong and asking for help, and both of which ego hates, but growth demands. The reply came later, simple, calm, no judgment, no criticism, just willingness to help. And that surprised Daniel, because he expected resistance, but instead he found openness. That moment taught him something important. People don't respect perfection. They respect honesty. They respect humility. They respect growth. Daniel felt something shift inside him. Not confidence, not success, something deeper: relief. Because for the first time, he wasn't pretending. He wasn't protecting his ego. He was learning, and learning feels different.
It's uncomfortable, but real. It challenges you, but grows you. That was the beginning, not of success, but of transformation, because Daniel had taken the hardest step. He faced himself, and now the real journey could begin.
Daniel thought admitting he was wrong would be the hardest part. It wasn't. The hardest part was what came after. Learning. Not the kind of learning that feels easy, not the kind where everything makes sense, but the kind that forces you to unlearn what you believed before. That kind of learning feels like losing, because every time you learn something new, you realize how much you didn't know, and that realization challenges your ego. Daniel started working with the person he had ignored before, not as an equal, not as someone who already knows, but as someone who needs to learn. That position felt uncomfortable because for years, Daniel saw himself as capable, confident, independent. Now, he had to listen, observe, ask questions, and most importantly, accept correction. The first few days were difficult. Every time he received feedback, his mind reacted. This isn't how I would do it. I think my way is better. They're overcomplicating things. The same old voice, his ego, still alive, still resisting. But this time, Daniel noticed it. He didn't act on it immediately. He paused, and that pause was powerful, because before, his ego controlled his actions. Now, he could see it. And when you can see something, you can choose differently. That's awareness, and awareness creates control. One day, while reviewing his work, he received detailed feedback, pointing out mistakes, gaps, weak decisions. Old Daniel would have defended, explained, justified, but this time he listened, quietly, carefully, without interrupting, and something strange happened. The feedback made sense. Clear sense, logical sense, the kind he couldn't deny. And that's when he understood something important. Ego doesn't just block growth, it blocks clarity. Because when you're protecting yourself, you're not seeing the truth, you're seeing what feels comfortable. Daniel started noticing a pattern. Every time he let go of his ego, he understood more, improved faster, saw things clearly. But every time his ego came back, he felt stuck, confused, defensive. That contrast became obvious, and that's when he realized something powerful. Growth requires humility, not weakness, not insecurity, but openness, the willingness to accept that you don't know everything, the willingness to be wrong, the willingness to learn. That's humility, and it's rare, because most people prefer comfort over growth. They prefer being right over being better. Daniel had lived that way for years, but now he was changing, not completely, not perfectly, but intentionally. He started asking more questions, not to prove a point, but to understand. He started listening more, not to respond, but to learn. He started observing more, not to judge, but to improve. And those small changes created big shifts. Slowly, his thinking changed, his approach changed, his mindset changed. He was no longer focused on being right, he was focused on getting better. And that shift is everything, because being right doesn't move you forward, growth does. Daniel also faced moments of discomfort, when his ideas were rejected, when his work was corrected, when his assumptions were challenged. Those moments felt heavy, because ego still existed. It didn't disappear, it adapted, tried to come back, tried to protect him. But now, Daniel was aware, and awareness made the difference. He didn't suppress his ego, he managed it, he recognized it, and chose not to follow it. That's discipline, mental discipline, and it's harder than physical effort, because it requires constant attention, constant control, constant awareness. But it pays off, because slowly, Daniel started improving, not in big, visible ways, but in small, meaningful ways. Better decisions, better understanding, better results. For the first time, progress felt real, not forced, not imagined, but earned. And that's the difference. Ego wants quick success,
Growth builds slow success. Daniel was finally on the right path, not because he became smarter, but because he became open, open to learning, open to change, open to truth, and that openness was transforming him. But the journey wasn't over, because the next phase would test something deeper, not his knowledge, not his skills, but his consistency. Because it's one thing to change once, it's another to stay changed. And that's where most people fail.
Daniel was improving, slowly, steadily. For the first time, his progress felt real, not imagined, not forced, but earned. He was learning, listening, adjusting, and it was working. That's when something unexpected happened. Ego came back. Not loudly, not aggressively, but quietly, subtly, almost invisibly. That's how ego works. It doesn't disappear. It waits for the right moment. And that moment is usually progress. Because when you start improving, you start feeling confident. And confidence, if unchecked, turns into ego. Daniel started noticing small changes. He began understanding things faster, making better decisions, getting positive feedback. People started appreciating his work, not heavily, but enough. And that enough was dangerous, because it triggered something inside him, a familiar feeling. I'm getting good at this. That thought seemed harmless, even positive, but behind it, ego was growing again. Not the old ego, but a new version, more refined, more subtle, more dangerous. Because now it was built on progress, and that makes it harder to detect. One day, Daniel received feedback again, similar to before, pointing out areas to improve, gaps, mistakes. But this time, his reaction was different, not completely defensive, but slightly resistant. I already improved a lot. I think this part is fine. They're being too critical. Small thoughts, small resistance, but enough. Enough to slow growth. Daniel didn't notice it immediately because it felt reasonable, logical, justified. That's how ego hides, not as arrogance, but as certainty. A few days later, he made a decision, ignored a suggestion, trusted his own approach, not fully wrong, but not fully right either. The result? Slower progress, not failure, but delay. And that's the danger. Ego doesn't always cause failure. Sometimes it just slows you down, and slow growth is harder to notice, but just as damaging. Daniel started feeling something, a slight frustration, not clear, not obvious, but present, because deep down he knew something wasn't right. That's when awareness returned, the same awareness that started everything. He paused, reflected, and asked himself a question. Am I learning or proving? That question changed everything, because it exposed something, his intention. Was he trying to grow or trying to show he had already improved? And the answer was uncomfortable. He was trying to prove that he had improved, prove that he understood, prove that he was right. And that is ego again. Daniel sat quietly, thinking about his recent actions, his reactions, his decisions, and slowly he saw it, the pattern returning. Different form, same root, ego. That realization didn't feel good, but it felt necessary, because now he could stop it before it grew bigger, before it controlled him again. He made another decision, not dramatic, not emotional, just clear. I will stay a student. That mindset changed everything, because a student doesn't need to prove. A student needs to learn, and learning requires openness every day, not just at the beginning, but throughout the journey. Daniel understood something powerful. Growth is not a one-time decision, it's a daily choice, because ego returns daily, in thoughts, in reactions, in decisions, and if you're not aware,
it takes over again. That's why consistency matters, not just in action, but in mindset. Daniel started practicing something simple. Before reacting, he paused. Before deciding, he questioned. Before assuming, he listened. Those small habits protected his growth because they kept his ego in check. Slowly, the resistance disappeared, the clarity returned, the learning continued, and the progress came back, stronger, more stable, more real. Daniel realized something important. Ego doesn't disappear, but it can be controlled, not by force, but by awareness. And awareness is a skill, one that must be practiced every day. Because the moment you stop, ego returns and growth stops. But Daniel wasn't stopping anymore. He had learned too much, seen too much, changed too much to go back. Now, he was ready for the next level. Not just learning, but becoming someone different. Someone who chooses growth over ego every time.
Daniel was no longer the same person. Not because his life suddenly changed, not because he became successful overnight, but because something inside him had shifted deeply. Before, Daniel reacted. Now he responded. Before, he defended. Now he listened. Before, he wanted to be right. Now he wanted to improve. That shift changed everything. It didn't make life easier, but it made life clearer. And clarity is powerful, because when things are clear, decisions become simple. Not easy, but simple. Daniel started noticing how differently he approached situations. Feedback no longer felt like an attack, it felt like information. Information he could use, information that could help him grow. That mindset removed something important: fear. The fear of being wrong. Because now, being wrong was not a weakness, it was a step forward. That's the mindset of growth, where mistakes are not failures, but lessons, where correction is not criticism, but direction. That shift made Daniel more open, more curious, more focused. He asked better questions, listened more deeply, observed more carefully, because now he wasn't trying to prove anything, he was trying to understand. And understanding creates mastery, slowly, consistently. Daniel also noticed something else. He felt lighter, less pressure, less stress. Because ego creates tension. It constantly needs to protect, to defend, to prove. But growth releases that pressure, because you don't need to prove, you just need to improve. That difference is huge, and it changes how you experience life. Daniel's conversations changed. Before, he listened to respond. Now, he listened to learn. Before, he focused on winning arguments. Now, he focused on understanding perspectives. That made him calmer, more grounded, more present. People noticed, not because he told them, but because his behavior changed, his energy changed. And energy is felt, not explained. One day, someone disagreed with him. Before, that would trigger a reaction, a need to defend, to explain, to prove. But this time, he stayed calm, listened, and said, "That's interesting. I didn't see it that way." Simple, but powerful, because it showed openness, not weakness. And that's something most people don't understand. Openness is strength, not insecurity, because it requires confidence, the confidence to not always be right. Daniel also became more patient with himself, with others, with the process, because growth takes time, and ego wants speed.
instant results, quick validation. But real growth is slow and steady and requires consistency. Daniel accepted that. He stopped rushing, stopped forcing, stopped expecting immediate success. Instead, he focused on daily improvement, small steps, consistent effort, clear direction. That approach created something powerful, momentum, not fast, but stable, and stability creates long-term success. Daniel looked back at his past, the old patterns, the old mindset, the old ego, and he realized something important. He wasn't wrong for thinking that way. He was just unaware. Because ego is natural. Everyone has it, but not everyone controls it. That's the difference, awareness and choice. Daniel now had both, and that gave him control. Not over others, but over himself. And that's the highest level of control. Self-control. The ability to choose growth even when ego wants to take over. That ability changed his identity. He was no longer someone who needed to be right. He was someone who needed to grow. And that identity is powerful because identity drives behavior, and behavior drives results. Daniel was becoming someone new. Not perfect, but better. Every day. And that's what matters. But the journey wasn't finished, because growth brings something new, success. And success creates a different kind of test. Not failure, not struggle, but something more subtle, more dangerous, comfort. And how Daniel handled that would define everything.
Success doesn't feel like danger. It feels like relief. After all the struggle, all the learning, all the mistakes, when things finally start working, it feels like you've made it. That's exactly when most people stop growing. Daniel didn't notice it immediately. At first, everything was positive. His work improved, his results became visible. People started recognizing his progress. Not in a big, dramatic way, but enough. Enough to feel different. Enough to feel ahead. And that feeling was the beginning of a new test. Because success brings comfort, and comfort is where growth slows down. Daniel started experiencing small changes, not obvious, not extreme, but subtle. He woke up a little later, delayed tasks slightly, skipped small improvements, nothing major, but consistent enough to matter. At the same time, something else returned, that familiar voice. You've improved a lot. You're doing better than before. You don't need to push this hard. The voice sounded supportive, encouraging, even logical. But behind it was ego, a new version, more refined, more convincing, because now it was based on truth. Daniel had improved, he had grown, but ego used that growth to slow him down. And that's the danger. Ego doesn't always stop you completely. Sometimes it just makes you comfortable, and comfort kills momentum. Daniel noticed something. His progress was still there, but it wasn't accelerating. It was stable, flat, and stability feels safe, but it's also a trap, because growth requires movement, not comfort. That realization came slowly, not from failure, but from awareness. He asked himself a question. Am I still growing or just maintaining? The answer wasn't clear at first, because maintenance feels like progress, but it's not. It's just staying in place, and staying in place is slow decline, because the world keeps moving, even if you don't. Daniel reflected on his recent habits, his routines, his mindset, and he saw it. The effort had reduced, the urgency had disappeared, the hunger had faded. Not completely, but enough.
And that's when he understood something powerful. Success is not the end of the journey. It's the beginning of a new level, where the challenge is different. Not learning, not struggling, but staying disciplined. Because when things are hard, you are forced to grow. But when things are easy, you have to choose to grow. And choice is harder than pressure. Daniel realized something deeper. Ego doesn't just appear in failure, it appears in success too, but in a different form, not as defense, but as comfort, not as resistance, but as relaxation. And that's why it's dangerous, because it feels right, even when it's wrong. Daniel made a decision, a conscious one. I will stay hungry, not desperate, not stressed, but aware. Aware that growth must continue even when things are working, especially when things are working. The next morning, he returned to his routine, woke up early, focused deeply, removed distractions, pushed himself, not because he had to, but because he chose to. That's discipline, and discipline protects growth. Daniel also changed how he viewed success. Before, it was a destination, something to reach. Now, it was a process, something to maintain, something to improve every day. That mindset removed comfort and replaced it with purpose. He stopped measuring himself by results and started measuring himself by effort, by consistency, by improvement. That shift kept him grounded because results can create ego, but effort creates growth. Daniel understood something most people don't. The real challenge is not reaching success, it's staying worthy of it. And that requires constant awareness, constant effort, constant humility. Without those, success fades slowly, quietly, until you're back where you started. Daniel refused to go back. He had worked too hard, changed too much, learned too deeply to lose it all to comfort. Now he was ready for the final realization, the one truth that separates those who grow from those who stay the same.
Daniel stood quietly by the window. The city looked the same. People moving, lights glowing, life continuing. But his perspective was completely different. He thought about everything, not just the results, not just the progress, but the process. The moments nobody saw, the decisions nobody noticed, the battles that happened inside him. That's where everything changed. Not outside, inside. For years, Daniel believed success was about knowing more, being smarter, having better ideas. But now he saw the truth. Success is not about what you know. It's about what you're willing to admit you don't know. That's the difference. Ego says, I already know. Growth says, I'm still learning. And that small difference creates completely different lives. Daniel remembered his past, the confidence he had, the certainty, the belief that he was right, and how that belief kept him stuck. Because when you think you know everything, you stop learning. And when you stop learning, you stop growing. That's the trap, the invisible one, the one most people never escape. Because ego feels good, it feels safe, it feels powerful. But it's a lie, a comfortable lie that slowly limits your potential. Growth feels different. It feels uncomfortable, uncertain, challenging, but it's real, and real things last. Daniel realized something deeper. Ego is not your enemy. It's a part of you, a natural part. Everyone has it. But the problem is not having ego. The problem is letting it control you. Because ego without control becomes limitation. But ego with awareness becomes balance.
That's the key. Not removing ego, but managing it, understanding it, recognizing it, and choosing not to follow it. That's what Daniel learned through failure, through reflection, through change. And that learning changed everything. He no longer feared being wrong because being wrong meant learning. He no longer avoided feedback because feedback meant improvement. He no longer needed to prove anything because growth doesn't need proof. It needs consistency. Daniel looked at his life now, not perfect, not easy, but real, progressing, improving, moving forward, and he knew exactly why. Because he made one shift. He chose growth over ego, every day, in every situation. Not once, not occasionally, but consistently. That's what made the difference. Because one decision doesn't change your life. Repeated decisions do. Daniel understood something most people don't. The real battle is not outside, it's inside, between comfort and growth, between certainty and curiosity, between ego and humility. And every day you choose a side. Most people don't realize that. They think life just happens, but it doesn't. It responds to your mindset, to your decisions, to your awareness. And that's why some people grow while others stay the same. Not because of luck, not because of talent, but because of choice. Daniel chose growth, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it challenged him, even when it required letting go of who he was. And that's what transformed him. Not success, but mindset. Because mindset creates everything else. The right mindset creates the right actions. The right actions create the right results. And the right results create the life you want. It all starts inside. Daniel took a deep breath, looked at the city again, and smiled. Not because he had everything figured out, but because he knew one thing. He would never stop growing. Because now he understood the truth, not just intellectually, but deeply, emotionally, practically. And that truth would guide him forward every day for the rest of his life.